The metal forceps went in. Maggie's scream was inhuman, raw. Then something gave way with an audible crack. Her pelvis had fractured. Dr. Brennan's voice cut through the chaos. One more push, just one more. Blood pooled beneath her. Too much blood. "I'm losing her pulse," Eliza said. Dan gripped Maggie's hand. It was cold, too cold. "Don't leave me," he whispered. "Please, Maggie, don't leave me." This is how it ended, or how it began, depending on how you look at it. Montana Territory, October 1883. The autumn wind carried the smell of dying grass and frost not yet arrived. Daniel Whitmore stood in the yard of his ranch, watching a woman twice the size of his first wife tell him she was carrying his child. "That's impossible," he said. Not angry, not yet, just numb. "You said the doctors told you." "They said unlikely." Maggie Lundstrom's voice was steady, but her hands twisted the fabric of her work dress. "You said impossible. There's a difference, Daniel, and you knew it." The words hit him like a rifle shot, clean, precise, leaving a hole that kept bleeding. He'd told himself it was safe. The whiskey had made it easier to believe. Sarah's death day 3 years gone, and he couldn't be alone with the memories. Maggie had been there, strong, capable, and supposedly unable to bear children. A perfect solution to his loneliness without consequence. Except now she stood here visibly pregnant, and the look in her eyes wasn't fear. It was something worse. Disappointment. "You gambled with my life," she said quietly, "and now I'm the one paying for it." The Montana sky stretched overhead vast and indifferent. A hawk circled in the distance, riding thermals Dan couldn't see. The ranch continued its daily rhythm. Cattle lowed in the far pasture. The windmill creaked its eternal song. Life went on uncaring that his world had just split open. He thought back to that night, 2 months ago, the anniversary of Sarah's death. The whiskey bottle half empty on the table, his hands shaking as he knocked on Maggie's door. "Just tonight," he'd said. "Just let me not be alone with this." She'd believed him, trusted him, let him seek comfort in her body because he'd convinced her it was safe, because the doctors in Sweden had said conception was highly unlikely, because he'd twisted unlikely into impossible and made her complicit in his self-deception. And now here they stood, 2 people bound by a mistake, a life growing between them that might kill her, that probably would kill her. Maggie turned away from him, walked toward the house. Her steps were measured, controlled. She didn't run, didn't collapse, just moved with that same steady determination he'd come to recognize over the past 5 months. "We need to go to Billings," she said without looking back. "Dr. Brennan needs to examine me properly." Dan found his voice. "When tomorrow? Tonight, if we can manage it. Every day we wait is a day I might not have." She disappeared into the house. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Not a slam. She didn't waste energy on displays of anger. That was Maggie. Everything purposeful. Everything controlled. Dan stood alone in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Sarah had loved Montana sunsets, said they made her feel small in a good way, connected to something bigger than herself. He'd buried her on the hill overlooking the ranch. 3 years ago this past August. She'd been 23 years old. The baby had been breech. Dr. Brennan couldn't turn it. She'd hemorrhaged for 6 hours before slipping away, the unnamed son dying with her. Dan had sworn then that he'd never marry again, couldn't watch another woman die, couldn't bury another wife. But loneliness was its own kind of death, slow, grinding, a man alone on a ranch talking to cattle and wind. So he'd placed an advertisement in the Chicago Tribune, practical, businesslike, no romance involved, just 2 people needing something from each other. And Maggie had answered. He remembered the first letter. Her handwriting was precise, almost masculine in its boldness. She'd laid out her terms clearly. She could work. She could manage a household. She could partner with him in all aspects of ranch life. But she could not give him children. 4 doctors in Stockholm had confirmed it. Narrow pelvis, hormonal irregularities. Her body simply wasn't designed for childbearing. If that's a problem, she'd written, "Find another wife." It hadn't been a problem. In fact, it had been perfect. A woman who couldn't get pregnant meant a marriage without risk, a partnership without the specter of death hanging over it. Sarah's ghost could rest. Dan could have companionship without consequence, except he'd been lying to himself, and now Maggie would pay the price. He looked up at Sarah's grave on the hill. The wooden cross was weathering, the name carved into it fading. He needed to replace it with stone. Had been meaning to for 2 years. Never got around to it. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered to the wind. "I'm about to do it again." The door opened. Maggie emerged carrying a small bag. She'd packed already. Of course she had. Efficient, prepared. That was Maggie. "We can leave at first light," she said. 3 days to Billings if we push hard." Dan nodded. "I'll saddle the horses." She looked at him then, really looked at him, those pale blue eyes that never seemed to miss anything. "Don't apologize," she said. "It's too late for apologies. Just help me survive this." She walked past him toward the barn, 6 feet tall in her stockinged feet, broad shoulders that could haul hay bales he struggled with, hands that could gentle a spooked horse or mend a fence with equal ease, a body the world had told her was wrong, too big, too masculine, not meant for the delicate work of creating life, and now that body was doing exactly what everyone said it couldn't, growing a child that might destroy her in the process. Dan followed her to the barn, started gathering tack. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 34 years of handling horses. But his mind was elsewhere, back to the beginning, to how this had all started, 6 months ago, spring 1883. He'd stood at this same spot mucking out stalls when the letter arrived. The postmaster in town had held it for a week before Dan made the trip in. International postage, Stockholm, Sweden. He'd read it 3 times before believing it was real. A woman willing to cross an ocean to marry a stranger. Not for love, not for romance, just for survival. Her family had died. Tuberculosis. She had no prospects in Sweden. No husband would have her at 29, especially not a woman of her size and condition. The mail-order bride advertisements represented her last chance at a life. He'd written back the same day, outlined the ranch, the work, the isolation. Montana territory was beautiful but brutal. Winters that could kill you if you weren't careful. Summers that baked the land dry. A life of hard labor and little comfort. If you can handle that, he'd written, you have a place here. 3 more letters. Negotiating terms. She'd been blunt about her medical condition. Sent copies of doctor's reports. All 4 physicians agreed. Conception highly unlikely. Carrying to term even less likely. She wanted him to understand what he was getting. "I need you to be clear," she'd written in her final letter. "I can work. I can partner with you. But I cannot give you children. If that's what you need, find another wife." He'd looked at Sarah's grave when he read that. The unmarked plot beside it where their son lay. The boy who'd never drawn breath. The child who'd killed his mother in the trying. "I don't need children," he'd written back. "I need help running this ranch. That's enough." She'd believed him, married him, worked beside him for 2 months without incident. And then came that night. August 15th, 3 years since Sarah died. The date circled in his mind like a vulture. Every year it came around, and every year it tore open the wound again. He'd started drinking at sunset. Whiskey from a bottle he saved for occasions that demanded numbing. By midnight he was drunk enough to do something stupid, lonely enough to justify it. He'd gone to her room, knocked on her door. She'd answered in her nightgown, candle in hand, concern on her face. "Daniel, you've been drinking. It's Sarah's day. 3 years. I just can't be alone tonight." She'd hesitated. He'd seen it. That moment where she could have said no, could have closed the door, could have saved herself. But she'd let him in. "We can sit," she'd offered. "Talk if you need." He hadn't wanted to talk, hadn't wanted comfort, just wanted to stop feeling for a few hours. Wanted to bury himself in something living and forget about death. "You said you can't have children," he'd said. "Doctors said impossible, right? So there's no risk. Just tonight. Just let me not be alone with this." And she'd believed him. Or maybe she'd wanted to believe him. Maybe she'd been lonely too. Maybe she'd wanted to feel wanted just once in her life, wanted to believe her body could do normal things like normal women's bodies. So she'd let him stay. Morning had come with shame and silence. He'd left before she woke, couldn't face what he'd done, couldn't acknowledge that he'd used her medical condition as permission, used her trust as justification. They'd gone back to work, pretended it never happened. She never brought it up. He never apologized, just buried it like he buried everything else, until she couldn't hide it anymore. The horses were saddled. Dan loaded supplies while Maggie checked the cinches. She moved carefully now. He could see it, the way she held herself, the way she avoided sudden movements. Already her body was changing, adapting to the impossible thing growing inside it. How far along, he asked. 14 weeks, she said. Maybe 15. Dr. Brennan will know for certain. That meant conception in early July, about 2 weeks after that night, which meant his timing had been perfect. Caught her right in the window where it could happen, where unlikely became inevitable. Maggie mounted her horse with practiced ease despite the pregnancy. She'd grown up on a farm outside Stockholm, had been riding since she was 6. It showed in how comfortable she was in the saddle, how naturally she moved with the horse's gait. They rode out as the sun dipped below the horizon. The ranch receded behind them. Sarah's grave disappeared into shadow. The life Dan had built over the past 10 years faded into memory. Ahead lay Billings, Dr. Marcus Brennan, medical examination and cold hard truth. Numbers that would tell them whether Maggie would live or die. The odds weren't good. Dan knew that, had known it the moment she told him. Women with normal anatomy died in childbirth all the time. Women like Maggie with pelvises too narrow and bodies too large had even less chance. He'd killed Sarah through ignorance. He'd kill Maggie through willful stupidity. The difference was he'd have to live with knowing he'd done it on purpose. They rode in silence for the first hour. The land stretched out around them, rolling plains dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of cottonwood. Montana in October was beautiful in a harsh sort of way. The grass had gone gold. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only got at high altitude. The air was crisp and clean and carried the promise of winter. Maggie broke the silence first. "Tell me about Sarah." Dan almost pulled up his horse. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, that wasn't on the list. "Why?" "Because I need to know. Because I'm going to die the same way she did, and I'd like to know what I'm in for." Her voice was matter-of-fact. Not bitter, not afraid, just practical. Maggie approaching death the same way she approached everything else, as a problem to understand and solve. She was 23, Dan said. We'd been married 5 years. She got pregnant in the winter. Dr. Brennan said everything looked normal. The pregnancy was textbook, no complications. Until the birth. Until the birth, Dan confirmed. Labor started normal, went on for 8 hours with regular progress. Then it stopped. The baby wouldn't come. Brennan examined her and found the baby was breech, feet first instead of head first. He tried to turn it, Maggie guessed. For 3 hours he tried. Sarah was exhausted. The baby was in distress. Finally, Brennan made the decision to try to deliver feet first. But something tore inside her. She started bleeding and couldn't stop. How long? 6 hours. She bled for 6 hours while we tried everything to stop it. Brennan packed her with cloth, applied pressure, used every technique he knew. Nothing worked. She just kept bleeding. Finally, she just slipped away. Quiet. Almost peaceful. The baby died 20 minutes later. Maggie absorbed this in silence. The horses walked on their hooves, crunching in the dry grass. Dr. Brennan delivered her, "Yes, and you still trust him to deliver me. He's the best doctor within 200 miles, and he learned from Sarah. Updated his techniques, studies new medical journals. If anyone can save you, it's Brennan. If anyone can save me," Maggie repeated. That's not exactly confidence-inspiring. Dan didn't have an answer for that. Because she was right. There were no guarantees, no promises he could make. Just hope and prayer and the skill of a frontier doctor who'd already failed once. They made camp at sunset, found a spot near a creek with decent grazing for the horses. Dan built a fire while Maggie unpacked food supplies. The routine was familiar. They'd done this before, back when they were getting to know each other, before everything went wrong. Maggie tried to eat but couldn't keep much down. The pregnancy made her nauseous, especially in the evenings. She nibbled on dried beef and bread, more going through the motions than actually eating. "You need to eat," Dan said. "I need to not vomit." "That would be nice." She sat by the fire wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. The light played across her face, highlighting the strong bones and sharp angles. She wasn't pretty in any conventional sense. Her features were too severe, her build too masculine. But there was something compelling about her, a presence, a solidity. Sarah had been delicate, small-boned and soft-spoken, the kind of woman men wanted to protect. She'd been overwhelmed by Montana. The isolation had crushed her. She'd cried herself to sleep most nights, missing Philadelphia and her family and everything civilized. Maggie was different. She didn't shrink from hardship, didn't complain about isolation. She took Montana as it came and adapted. The land didn't overwhelm her. If anything, she seemed to expand into the space, to fill it in a way Sarah never could, which made it that much worse that he might lose her. "Can I ask you something?" Dan said. "Always. Why didn't you end it?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy, loaded. Maggie didn't answer right away, just kept staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in her pale eyes. "Dr. Brennan offered," she said finally. "When I went to him for the examination, he told me about the risks, explained my chances. Then he very carefully mentioned that there were options, that it wasn't too late to prevent the pregnancy from progressing. And I thought about it. For about 10 seconds I thought about it. Then I realized something. What in Sweden doctors told me I was broken, defective, not meant to be a mother. They looked at my body and saw only what it couldn't do, what it wasn't designed for." She turned to look at him then. "If my body is doing something it's not supposed to do, maybe I was never broken. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe I'm more than they said I was." Dan felt something twist in his chest. "Even if it kills you, even then, at least I'll die proving I was more than they said. That's the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever heard." Maggie smiled without humor. Coming from a man who married a stranger to avoid being lonely, that's rich. She had him there. They were both running from something, both trying to prove something, both gambling with life and death and calling it fate. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. The sound was lonely and wild and perfectly suited to the Montana night. "I'm scared," Maggie said quietly. It was the first time she'd admitted it. The first crack in that armor of practical determination she wore like a second skin. "So am I," Dan admitted. "Good." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Fear means we're paying attention, means we understand what's at stake." They sat in silence after that. The fire burned down to coals. The stars came out brilliant and cold. Dan lay in his bedroll staring up at the vast Montana sky, wondering how he'd ended up here, how he'd managed to put another woman in mortal danger, how he'd become the kind of man who'd do this twice. Sleep didn't come easy. When it finally did, it brought dreams of blood and screaming and graves on hillsides overlooking empty ranches. Morning came cold and clear. They broke camp at first light, pushing the horses hard. Maggie sat her saddle stoically, but Dan could see the pain, the way she held herself rigid, the way she gripped the pommel during rougher stretches. They needed to reach Billings, needed to get her under proper medical care. Every hour mattered now. Around mid-morning, Maggie's nose started bleeding. Dan saw it first, a thin trickle of red against her pale skin. She wiped it away absently, then looked at her hand in confusion. "Your nose," Dan said, pulling his horse up short. Maggie touched her face, fingers coming away bloody. The color drained from her cheeks. "It's nothing, just the dry air. Brennan said any bleeding. Brennan says a lot of things." She wiped her nose again, but the blood kept coming. "Damn it, we need to stop." "No, we need to keep moving. The faster we get to Billings, the faster Brennan can actually help." But Dan had already dismounted. He pulled a cloth from his saddlebag, wet it from his canteen. Maggie took it with obvious reluctance, pressing it to her nose. 5 minutes, she said. Then we ride. They stood there in the middle of the Montana plains, horses stamping, wind blowing, Maggie bleeding into a cloth, while Dan tried not to panic. This was just the beginning. He knew that. Things would get worse before they got better, if they got better at all. The bleeding stopped after a few minutes. They mounted up and continued, but something had shifted. The situation had become real in a way it hadn't been before. Abstract danger had become concrete, visible, undeniable. They reached Eagle Creek by late afternoon, made camp in a stand of cottonwoods near the water. The horses needed rest. Maggie needed rest, though she wouldn't admit it. Dan set about making camp while Maggie sat on a fallen log staring at the water. She looked exhausted. The ride was taking its toll. Her face was drawn, her movements slow. "I can't do this for 2 more days," she said. "Yes, you can." "How do you know? Because you're the strongest person I've ever met." Maggie laughed. It came out bitter. Strong. Everyone says that. Like it's supposed to be a compliment. Like being strong means I don't hurt, don't get tired, don't break like normal women. I didn't mean it that way. Yes, you did. That's why you married me. Because I'm strong enough to not need anything from you. Strong enough to not be a burden. Strong enough to die quietly without making you feel too guilty. The words cut deep because they were true. That's exactly what he'd wanted. A woman who wouldn't demand, wouldn't need, wouldn't make him vulnerable again. "I'm sorry," he said. "Stop apologizing." She stood, moved to where he was building the fire. "If you really want to help, tell me the truth. What are my actual chances?" Dan looked at her. At this woman who was about to risk her life because of his selfishness, who deserved honesty even if it hurt. Honestly, maybe 40% you survive, maybe less if there are complications. And the baby, if you survive, the baby probably survives. If the baby survives, you probably don't. So one or the other, not both. Maybe both. If we're lucky. Maggie absorbed this, nodded. Okay. Then we focus on me living. If the baby makes it, that's good. If not, at least I'll still be here to try again with someone less stupid than you. Dan almost smiled. Almost. She was planning her future, planning for survival. That was good. That meant she hadn't given up. They ate in silence as the sun set. Maggie managed to keep down a little food this time. Progress. Small victories. Night fell. The temperature dropped. Dan built up the fire while Maggie wrapped herself in blankets. She was shivering despite the warmth. Her body was working overtime, growing a child and fighting to survive. Every calorie mattered. Every hour of rest mattered. Around midnight, she woke screaming. Dan was on his feet instantly, knife in hand, scanning for threats. But there was nothing. Just Maggie tangled in her blankets, gasping for air. Just a dream she managed. "I'm fine." He knelt beside her. "You're not fine." "Swedish doctor," she said. "In my dream, telling me I wasn't meant for this, that my body was wrong, that I was a mistake of nature." Her voice broke on the last word. Dan had never heard Maggie cry, hadn't thought she could, but there were tears on her cheeks now, glinting in the firelight. Without thinking, he put his arms around her. She tensed for a moment, then collapsed against him, shaking. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Every day I'm more terrified." "I know. Do you? Do you really know what it's like to feel your body doing something that might kill you? To feel something growing inside you that might be the last thing you ever feel?" Dan held her tighter. "No, I don't. But I watched Sarah go through it, watched her get more scared every day, watched her know something was wrong and not be able to stop it." Maggie pulled back, looked at him. "And you swore you'd never put another woman through that." "Yes." "Then why did you marry me?" "Because I thought I'd found a loophole. A woman who couldn't die giving me children because she couldn't have them." "A loophole," Maggie repeated. "You married me because you thought I was safe." Dan couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes." She pushed away from him, wrapped the blankets tighter around herself. "Well, I guess we both got what we deserved. I wanted safety. You wanted safety, and now we're both about to lose everything." She lay back down, turned away from him. The conversation was over. Dan returned to his bedroll but didn't sleep. Just lay there staring at the stars, listening to Maggie's breathing gradually even out, listening to the night sounds of Montana, the creek flowing, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant howl of wolves. He'd made so many mistakes, chosen safety over courage, comfort over risk. And now Maggie would pay the price. Again. Just like Sarah had paid the price. He was a coward. He'd always been a coward. The war had taught him that survival meant keeping your head down, not taking chances, not sticking your neck out. But you couldn't live that way forever. Eventually life forced your hand, made you choose, made you risk. And he'd chosen wrong. Again. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. They broke camp in silence. Maggie moved stiffly, clearly in pain, but she didn't complain, just saddled her horse and mounted up. Second day's ride was harder. The landscape grew rougher, hills rolled into small mountains, the trail became less defined, and the sky began to darken. "Storm coming," Dan observed. "We can outrun it. Not if it's what I think it is. That's a Montana thunderstorm. We need to find shelter." Maggie looked at the sky, then at him. "How long hour? Maybe 2. Then we ride hard for an hour and find shelter after." They pushed the horses faster, but Montana weather had its own schedule. The storm caught them with 30 minutes to go. Rain came sideways, driven by wind that screamed across the plains. Thunder cracked like artillery. Lightning split the sky. There, Dan pointed to a dark shape ahead. "Looks like a structure." They rode for it. Turned out to be an abandoned trapper's cabin. Roof mostly intact, walls still standing. Good enough. They got the horses into a lean-to on the side, then burst through the cabin door. Both were soaked through, shivering. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Dan immediately started gathering anything that would burn. Old furniture, floorboards from a corner, broken crates. He had a fire going within minutes. The heat was glorious. Maggie stood as close as she dared, shaking uncontrollably. "We need to get out of these wet clothes." Dan turned his back while she changed. Found a moth-eaten blanket in a corner. It smelled like mice, but it was dry. He offered it to her. She wrapped it around herself, still shivering. "How long will the storm last?" "Could be hours, could be all night. Then I guess we're stuck here." She moved around the cabin, exploring. It was a single room, maybe 12 by 12 feet. Rough-hewn log walls, dirt floor, a table missing one leg, a chair with no seat, the accumulated debris of someone's failed dream. Someone lived here once, Maggie observed. Trapper, probably. Or a prospector. Montana's full of cabins like this. People come looking for gold or fur. Find nothing but hard work and isolation. Eventually they give up and move on. Maggie picked up something from the floor. A book. Water-damaged and falling apart, but still readable. She opened it carefully. "It's a journal," she said. "Put it down. That's private. The person who wrote it is long gone, and I need something to take my mind off being cold and wet and pregnant in an abandoned cabin during a thunderstorm." She sat by the fire and started reading. Dan added more wood to the flames and tried to wring out his shirt. The storm showed no signs of letting up. They were stuck here until it passed. "Listen to this," Maggie said after a few minutes. She started reading aloud. March 12, 1872. "Mary is 6 months along now. Her belly grows larger every day. She's scared, though she tries not to show it. We're 40 miles from the nearest doctor. If something goes wrong during the birth, I won't be able to help her." She flipped pages. May 3, 1872. "The baby came last night. Mary labored for 14 hours. I did everything I could. Boiled water, tore sheets into cloth, held her hand and told her she was doing fine. But something went wrong. The bleeding wouldn't stop. She looked at me with those beautiful eyes and asked if she was dying. I lied and said no. She died 20 minutes later. The baby, a girl, lived for 3 hours. I buried them together on the hill behind the cabin. This wilderness took them both from me." Maggie's voice had gone soft. She turned more pages. May 15, 1872. "I can't stay here. Every corner of this cabin holds her memory. I'm leaving tomorrow. heading east, back to civilization, back to a world that doesn't kill women for the crime of trying to bring life into it. If any man reads this, take my advice. Don't bring women to this land. It's beautiful and brutal, and it kills the gentle ones. She closed the journal, set it down carefully. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. That's what happened to Sarah. Maggie said quietly, "Isn't it?" "Yes. And that's what you think will happen to me." It was Dan's turn to be honest. "Yes. That's exactly what I think will happen." Maggie stared into the fire. The flames reflected in her eyes. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Rain hammered the roof. The storm showed no mercy. "Why did you marry me then?" she asked. "If you thought any pregnancy could kill me because I convinced myself it couldn't happen, because the doctors said it was impossible, because I wanted to believe I'd found a way around fate." "A loophole," Maggie repeated, just like before. Dan moved to sit beside her. Not close enough to touch, just close enough to be present. "I swore after Sarah that I'd never put another woman through that I'd never marry again because I couldn't watch another wife die, couldn't bury another woman I'd gotten pregnant. But you did it anyway." Her voice wasn't accusing, just stating fact, observing the truth between them. "I did it anyway," Dan confirmed. "I did exactly what I swore I'd never do." "Why?" "Because I'm weak, because I was lonely, because I convinced myself that if you couldn't get pregnant then I wasn't really breaking my promise. But I could get pregnant, and you knew it was possible. I knew it was unlikely. I chose to interpret that as impossible because that's what I wanted to believe." Maggie turned to look at him. "And now I do everything I can to keep you alive. I take you to Brennan. I follow every instruction. I don't leave your side. I accept that I'm responsible for whatever happens. And if I die, then I put a bullet in my head within the week." The words came out flat, matter of fact. Dan had already decided, had been carrying that plan since the moment she told him she was pregnant. Maggie's eyes widened. "You don't mean that." "I absolutely mean that. I've killed 2 wives now through my own stupidity and selfishness. I don't get to keep living after that." "Don't put that on me," Maggie said, voice sharp. "Don't make me responsible for keeping you alive too." "I'm not. I'm telling you what's true, what I've already decided." "Well, decide something else." She stood, began pacing despite the small space. "I'm going to survive this, and when I do, I need you to be here. Grace needs a father." Grace. That's what I'm calling her. Grace. Undeserved gift. How do you know it's a girl I don't? But if I survive this, it'll be by Grace. So that's her name. Dan felt something break open in his chest. Some wall he'd been holding up since Sarah died. Since before Sarah died. Since the war, maybe. Since he'd learned that survival meant not caring too much, not feeling too deep. "You're going to survive this," he said. "Not because I believe it, because you're too stubborn to die." Maggie almost smiled. Stubbornness isn't enough, but it's a start. They sat together as the storm raged outside. The fire burned low. Dan added more wood. The cabin was warm now, almost comfortable despite the circumstances. "Tell me about the war," Maggie said. "Why?" "Because I want to know who you were before you became this. Before the ranch. Before Sarah. Before me." Dan considered refusing, but she'd shared her fear, her vulnerability. Fair was fair. I was 18 when I enlisted. Didn't really understand what I was signing up for. Just knew there was a war and men were expected to fight. Which side union? My family was from Pennsylvania. Couldn't own slaves there, so didn't see much point in defending the practice elsewhere. What did you do? Cavalry. Rode with the 5th Pennsylvania. Saw action at Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg. Did you kill anyone? Dan looked at the fire. Many people. Does it bother you every day? Every single day. Good, Maggie said. That means you're still human. They talked through the night. About the war. About Sweden. About the choices that had led them both to this abandoned cabin in Montana Territory. About the futures they'd imagined and the reality they'd gotten instead. Somewhere around midnight, Maggie fell asleep. Dan stayed awake, keeping the fire going, listening to her breathe. She looked younger in sleep, less guarded, almost peaceful despite everything. He'd done this to her, put her in this position, gambled with her life for his own comfort. If she survived, he'd spend the rest of his life making it right, not because she'd forgive him, but because it was what he owed her, what he owed Grace, what he owed Sarah and the unnamed son buried beside her. If she died, he'd keep his promise, end it clean. Let someone else have the ranch, someone who wouldn't kill women through carelessness and cowardice. But she wasn't going to die. He had to believe that, had to hold on to that thread of hope even when everything else said it was impossible. Because Maggie was impossible, a Swedish woman who shouldn't exist, who shouldn't be pregnant, who shouldn't be able to survive what was coming. But impossible didn't mean it couldn't happen, just meant it was unlikely. And sometimes unlikely was enough. Morning came gray and wet. The storm had passed, but left the world sodden. They ate a cold breakfast, saddled the horses, prepared to ride. Maggie stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking back at the journal on the table. "Should we bury it?" she asked. "Leave it. Maybe someone else will find it. Learn from it. What's there to learn that love isn't enough? That good intentions don't stop bad outcomes, that sometimes the wilderness wins no matter how hard you fight." Maggie considered this, then said, "Or maybe they'll learn that even when the wilderness wins, the story doesn't end. Someone else comes along, finds the journal, keeps living, keeps trying." "Which story would you rather be?" Dan asked. "Both," Maggie said. "The one who dies and the one who keeps living, because they're the same story, just different chapters." They mounted up and rode toward Billings, toward Dr. Brennan and medical examination and cold hard truth, toward whatever future waited for them at the end of 3 days' hard riding. The land stretched out ahead, Montana in all its brutal beauty, unforgiving and magnificent, a place that killed the unprepared and tempered the survivors into something harder, something that could withstand the wind and the cold and the crushing loneliness. Maggie sat her horse like she'd been born to it, back straight despite the pain, face forward despite the fear, moving toward danger because the only way out was through. Dan followed, not leading, not protecting, just accompanying, because that's all he could do now, be present for whatever came, bear witness to his mistake and its consequences. The sun broke through the clouds, light spilled across the golden grass. The horses walked on steady and sure. Behind them the abandoned cabin faded into memory. Ahead Billings waited with answers they weren't ready to hear. But they kept riding anyway, because impossible didn't mean it couldn't happen, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. The third day broke clear and cold. They'd camped near Copper Ridge, 30 miles from Billings. Dan woke to find Maggie already up, standing at the edge of camp, staring east toward where the town lay hidden beyond the horizon. She looked exhausted. The journey was grinding her down. 3 days of hard riding while pregnant, sleeping on cold ground, eating food that made her nauseous. But she stood there with her back straight, refusing to show weakness. "We can make it by sunset if we push," Dan said, rolling up his bedroll. "Then we push." They rode in silence through the morning. The landscape gradually changed as they approached Billings. More settlements, more signs of civilization. A homestead here, a small ranch there. The isolation of the open plains giving way to something almost like community. Around midday, they crested a rise and saw Billings spread out below them. Bigger than Dan remembered, maybe 200 people now, actual streets laid out in a grid, buildings that looked permanent instead of temporary, a church steeple, a schoolhouse, the trappings of a town that planned to survive. "There it is," Maggie said quietly. "You already know. But that doesn't matter, does it?" They rode down into town as the sun began its descent. People stopped to stare as they passed. Maggie on her horse, tall and visibly pregnant, was hard to miss. Dan heard the whispers, saw the pointing, felt the judgment. Maggie seemed not to notice. Or maybe she was just used to being stared at. Either way, she kept her eyes forward, her face impassive. Dr. Brennan's house sat at the edge of town, a neat two-story structure with a shingle hanging by the door. Marcus Brennan Medicine and Surgery. Professional. Established. The kind of sign that said this man knew what he was doing. The door opened before they could knock. Dr. Brennan stood there, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, taking in the sight of them with a single, practiced glance. "You're the woman from Dan's telegram," he said. "The impossible case." "Margaret Whitmore," Maggie said. "And I'm starting to hate that phrase. Come in, both of you. We don't have much time to waste." The interior of the house was clean and organized. Medical texts lined shelves, anatomy charts hung on walls, the smell of carbolic acid and clean linen. Dr. Brennan led them to an examination room at the back of the house. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to change into this gown, Mr. Whitmore. You'll wait outside." "I want him here," Maggie said. Dr. Brennan looked at her, then at Dan. "This examination will be invasive and uncomfortable. Most husbands prefer not to watch. I don't care what most husbands prefer. I want mine here." The doctor shrugged. "Your choice. Change behind the screen." Maggie disappeared behind a folding screen. Dan stood awkwardly, unsure where to look or what to do. Dr. Brennan prepared his instruments with methodical precision, sterilizing, arranging, the ritual of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. "How long have you known her?" the doctor asked quietly. 6 months, 5 as husband and wife. And the pregnancy was unexpected. Dan met his eyes. The pregnancy was impossible, according to 4 Swedish doctors. I convinced her that impossible meant safe. Dr. Brennan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, maybe, or judgment. "I see," was all he said. Maggie emerged in the examination gown. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, but her jaw was set, her shoulders back, ready to face whatever came next. The examination took 45 minutes. Dan stood by Maggie's head, holding her hand while Dr. Brennan performed his assessment, measuring, palpating, listening through a wooden stethoscope, making notes in a leather-bound journal. Maggie endured it stoically. Only her grip on Dan's hand betrayed her discomfort. She squeezed hard during the internal examination, hard enough to grind his bones together. He didn't complain. Finally, Dr. Brennan stepped back. "You can get dressed now, then we'll talk." Maggie changed behind the screen again while the doctor washed his hands and reviewed his notes. Dan tried to read his face, tried to find some hint of good news. Found nothing. They reconvened in the doctor's office. Maggie sat in a wooden chair. Dan stood behind her. Dr. Brennan settled behind his desk, opened his journal. "You're approximately 14 weeks pregnant," he began. "The baby is positioned normally. Heartbeat is strong. By those measures, this is a healthy pregnancy." But Maggie prompted. "But your anatomy presents significant challenges." He pulled out a diagram, pointed to various measurements. "Your pelvic inlet measures 9.8 centimeters. The average woman's pelvis measures 11 to 12 centimeters. That's a difference of nearly 2 centimeters. And the baby's head won't be known until closer to delivery. But average newborn head circumference is about 9 centimeters. If your baby is average or larger, there will be complications." "What kind of complications?" Dan asked. "The baby's head may not fit through the pelvic opening. If that happens, we have 3 options. First, cesarean section. I cut through the abdominal wall and remove the baby directly. Success rate for the procedure is about 50%. 50% of mothers survive. 50% don't. What's the second option? Induce labor early. Try to deliver before the baby grows too large. But premature babies have their own risks. The earlier we deliver, the less chance the baby has of surviving. And the third, we wait. Hope the baby is small. Hope your body adapts. Hope everything goes right during delivery. And prepare for it to go wrong." Maggie sat perfectly still. "What do you recommend?" Dr. Brennan leaned back in his chair. "I recommend you move to Billings immediately. Take a room at Ruth Calloway's boarding house. Complete bed rest from now until delivery. I want you close so I can monitor the pregnancy. And I want you here when labor starts because every minute will matter." "How much will this cost?" Dan asked. "Room at Ruth's is $2 a week. My services will be $50 total, paid half now and half after delivery. Assuming you live to pay it," he added, looking at Maggie. She didn't flinch. "And my actual chances? Numbers, not platitudes." The doctor was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Honestly, I'd say you have a 40% chance of surviving delivery, maybe 35 if there are complications. The baby has slightly better odds, maybe 60%. So one or the other," Maggie said. "Not both. Maybe both if we're very lucky. But I won't lie to you, Mrs. Whitmore. This pregnancy could kill you, probably will kill you. Any other doctor would have already advised termination. And why haven't you? Because you're here in my office 3 days hard ride from your home asking me how to survive. That tells me you've already made your choice. My job now is to give you the best chance possible." Maggie nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do. I'll take the room. Follow your instructions. And I'll survive because I'm too stubborn to die, proving those Swedish doctors right." A ghost of a smile crossed Brennan's face. "Stubbornness helps, but it won't be enough. You'll need luck and skill and more strength than you've ever had to use before. Good thing I'm built like a workhorse then." Dr. Brennan extended his hand. "I delivered Dan's first wife. She died on my table despite everything I tried. I won't let that happen again if I can help it." Maggie shook his hand. Her grip was firm despite everything. "Then we understand each other." "There was one more thing," the doctor said, looking at Dan. "Something I need to tell you both." What Dan asked. Sarah's pelvis was normal width. She didn't die because of her anatomy. She died because the baby was breech, and I couldn't turn it in time. Her death was unforeseeable. The words hit Dan like a physical blow. "What, you let me think she died because childbirth was inherently dangerous, that any pregnancy could have killed her. But the truth is her death was a complication, an accident, not inevitable." "That's right." Dan felt the room tilt. "So when I married Maggie, when I told myself any pregnancy could be dangerous." "You were lying to yourself," Brennan finished. "Sarah's death was tragic but not predictable. Maggie's death, if it happens, will be entirely predictable. You made this choice knowing the risk. That's the difference." Maggie turned to look at Dan. Her face was unreadable. "You knew her pelvis was normal. I convinced myself I didn't. Convinced myself that all childbirth was dangerous, so I wasn't really choosing to risk you specifically. But you were." "Yes, I was." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dr. Brennan cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll leave you two to discuss this. Come back tomorrow morning. I'll have arrangements made with Ruth." He left the room. Dan and Maggie sat in the heavy quiet. Outside Billings carried on with its daily business. People walked past the window. A dog barked. Life continued indifferent to the truth that had just been laid bare. "You let me think this was fate," Maggie said finally, "that we were both victims of bad luck and my faulty body. I let myself think that too. But it wasn't. It was a choice. Your choice. You gambled with my life because you couldn't stand being alone for one more night." "Yes." Maggie walked to the window. "I should leave you. Take whatever money we have and disappear. Raise this baby alone rather than stay with a man who'd risk killing me for his own comfort." "Why don't you?" "Because I have nowhere to go. Because I need Dr. Brennan. Because leaving would mean admitting I made a mistake marrying you, and I'm not ready to admit that yet." She turned back to face him. "And because despite everything I think you might actually be sorry, actually understand what you did. That's more than most men would manage." "I am sorry," Dan said. "More than I've been sorry for anything in my life. Sorry doesn't change the odds, doesn't make my pelvis wider or this baby smaller. Sorry is just words. Then tell me what else I can do. Be here. Don't leave. Don't run when it gets hard. You put me in this position now. You stay and face it with me." "I will. I swear it. Your swears don't mean much to me right now, but I'll hold you to it anyway." They left the doctor's office as the sun was setting. The sky was painted in reds and golds, the last light of day painting Billings in warm tones. It would have been beautiful if Dan could have focused on anything other than the truth Brennan had forced him to face. He'd killed Sarah through bad luck. He was killing Maggie through choice. The difference mattered. The difference changed everything. Ruth Calloway's boarding house stood 3 blocks from the doctor's office. A large Victorian structure well-maintained with flower boxes in the windows and a sign that read, "Rooms available, meals included." Ruth herself answered the door. A tall woman at least 6 feet in her stockinged feet with gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. "You'll be the Whitmores," she said. Dr. Brennan sent word. "Come in." The interior was clean and comfortable. Wallpaper with a floral pattern. Hardwood floors that gleamed. The smell of bread baking and wood smoke. Homey in a way Dan's ranch had never been. "I've got a room on the 2nd floor," Ruth said, leading them up a narrow staircase. "South-facing, gets good light. $2 a week, includes breakfast and supper. Lunch is extra if you want it." She opened a door to reveal a modest room. A bed, a dresser, a washstand, a chair by the window. Simple but clean. Maggie walked to the window, looked out over Billings Main Street. "It'll do," she said. "Good." Ruth set her hands on her hips. "Now let me be clear about rules. No drinking in the rooms, no loud disturbances. Meals are served at 7 noon and 6. You're late, you go hungry. Laundry is extra 2 bits a load." "Understood," Dan said. Ruth looked at Maggie more carefully. "How far along are you?" 14 weeks. "And Brennan says bed rest, starting tomorrow." "Good, because you look like you're about to collapse. When was the last time you ate a proper meal?" Maggie thought about it. "Before we left the ranch. 3 days ago." "Sweet Jesus." Ruth shook her head. "You sit down right now. I'll bring up soup and bread. You need to eat before you fall over." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're pregnant and exhausted and 3 days from medical care. Now sit before I make you sit." There was something in Ruth's voice that brooked no argument. Maggie sat. Ruth nodded in approval and left the room. "I like her," Maggie said after the door closed. "She's terrifying. She's practical. That's better than nice." Ruth returned 20 minutes later with a tray. Chicken soup, fresh bread butter, and a pot of tea. The smell made Dan's stomach growl. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. "Eat all of it," Ruth commanded. "Both of you. You look half-starved." They ate in silence. The soup was rich and warming. The bread was still warm from the oven. Real food after 3 days of trail rations. It was almost enough to make Dan forget the conversation at Brennan's office. Almost. When they'd finished, Ruth collected the tray. "You'll be wanting to rest now. Breakfast is at 7 sharp. Don't be late." She left, closing the door behind her. Dan and Maggie were alone in the small room. The bed dominated the space, a single bed meant for one person or a couple who didn't mind closeness. "I'll sleep on the floor," Dan said. "Don't be stupid. The bed's big enough for 2 if we're careful." "Maggie." "I'm too tired to argue. And we're married. Sharing a bed shouldn't be scandalous." She changed into her nightgown behind the folding screen in the corner, then climbed into bed with a weariness that went bone deep. Dan followed suit, staying as far to his side as possible. The room was dark except for moonlight through the window. Outside, Billings settled into sleep. Dogs barked in the distance. Someone laughed on the street below. Normal sounds of normal life. Maggie's voice came quiet in the darkness. "Yes, tomorrow it starts. The bed rest. The waiting. The slow march toward either survival or death." "Yes, I'm scared." It was the second time she'd admitted it. The second crack in her armor. "So am I," Dan said. "Good. We should be scared. Fear keeps us honest." They lay in silence for a while. Then Maggie spoke again. "Tell me something true." "What do you mean, something true about you? Something you've never told anyone?" Dan thought about it. During the war, he said, "Finally, I shot a boy." Couldn't have been more than 15. He was wearing a Confederate uniform, but he looked terrified. I could have let him run, could have fired high, but I didn't. I shot him center mass and watched him die. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked for truth. Because you're about to risk your life because of my mistakes, because you deserve to know exactly who I am." Maggie was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what? For not lying. For not trying to make yourself sound better than you are." They fell asleep like that. Not touching. Not comforting each other. Just two people lying in the dark, facing truth and fear and an uncertain future. The next morning Dan woke to find Maggie already up dressed, sitting by the window. The sun was just rising, painting the room in soft gold. "You should be resting," he said. "I am resting. Just doing it by the window instead of in bed." Ruth's voice called from downstairs. "Breakfast." They went down to find a dining room filled with other boarders, an older couple who ran a dry goods store, a young man who worked at the railway depot, a traveling salesman passing through, and a woman about Maggie's age with haunted eyes and capable hands. Ruth made introductions. "This is Eliza Hayes. She's apprenticing with Dr. Brennan, learning midwifery." Eliza looked at Maggie with obvious interest. "You're the impossible pregnancy." "Word travels fast," Maggie observed. "Small town. And your case is medically interesting." There was something in Eliza's voice. Not cruelty, just clinical interest. The way a scientist might observe a rare specimen. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Good solid food. Dan ate hungrily. Maggie picked at her plate, managing a few bites before the nausea took over. After breakfast, Ruth pulled them aside. "Dr. Brennan stopped by early this morning, left instructions. Mrs. Whitmore is to stay in bed except for necessary movement. Light meals, plenty of water. He'll check on her twice a week." "And what about Dan?" Maggie asked. Ruth looked at him. "You'll need work if you plan to stay. Can't afford room and board plus the doctor on ranch savings alone. What kind of work? Talk to Samuel Chen at the general store. He's always needing help with heavy lifting. And the railway depot needs night watchmen." Dan nodded. "I'll go today." The next weeks fell into a pattern. Dan worked during the day whatever jobs he could find, loading freight at the depot, hauling supplies for Samuel Chen, mucking stalls at the livery, hard physical labor that left him exhausted but didn't require thinking. Maggie stayed in the room, confined to bed rest. Ruth brought her meals. Eliza visited daily, teaching her breathing exercises and checking her condition. Dr. Brennan came twice a week to measure and assess and make notes in his journal. The baby grew. Maggie's belly swelled. The pregnancy became impossible to hide or ignore. November arrived with cold winds and the promise of winter. Dan had been working at Samuel Chen's store for 2 weeks, unloading freight wagons and organizing inventory. Samuel was a quiet man, middle-aged, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard his entire life. He'd come to Montana during the gold rush of the 60s, found no gold but decided to stay anyway, built his store from nothing, served the community with quiet efficiency. "Your wife Samuel said one afternoon while they were stacking crates, 'The doctor says her chances aren't good.'" "That's right. You knew this could happen when you got her pregnant?" Dan stopped working. Looked at Samuel directly. "Yes. I knew it was possible. I chose to believe it was impossible because that's what I wanted to believe." Samuel nodded slowly. "At least you're honest about it. Doesn't make it right." "No, but it's something. My grandmother used to say the first step to fixing a mistake is admitting you made it. What's the second step? Living with the consequences." Samuel hefted a crate. "And doing everything you can to make it right, even when you know you can't." Dan thought about that as he worked. Living with consequences. That's what he was doing now. Watching Maggie grow weaker as the baby grew stronger. Watching her body wage war against itself. Knowing he'd caused it. Knowing sorry would never be enough. By early December, Maggie was nearly 6 months along. The baby was active now, kicking hard enough to be visible through her dress. Dr. Brennan measured and frowned and made more notes. "The baby is large," he told them during one examination. 75th percentile for size. That's not good news for your pelvis." "How large?" Maggie asked. "If I had to guess, I'd say we're looking at an 8-pound baby, maybe more, and my pelvis is 9.8 centimeters. An 8-pound baby typically has a head circumference of about 9 centimeters. It's going to be very close. So what are you saying? I'm saying your odds just got worse. I'm recalculating to 35% survival, maybe 30 if there are complications. Maggie absorbed this without visible reaction. What can I do? Nothing. Just rest. Eat what you can. Let your body prepare as best it can. That night, Dan found her crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears streaming down her face as she stared out the window at the December darkness. He sat beside her. Didn't speak, just sat. I'm going to die, she said finally. You know that, right? The numbers don't lie. 35% means I'm probably going to die. You don't know that. Yes, I do. And so do you. She turned to look at him. I need you to promise me something. Anything. If I die and the baby lives, don't raise her with guilt. Don't make her carry the weight of what happened between us. Just let her be. Maggie. Promise me, Daniel. He wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she'd survive. But she deserved honesty. You're not going to die. I won't let it happen. You might not have a choice. Then I'll tear the world apart before I let you die because of what I did. Maggie almost smiled. That's very dramatic. But reality doesn't care about determination. They sat together in the darkness. Outside, Billings slept. Inside, a man and a woman faced the consequences of his choice and her determination to survive it. Christmas came and went. Ruth cooked a feast. The boarders exchanged small gifts. It was almost pleasant, almost normal, except for the specter hanging over everything. The knowledge that Maggie was approaching the point where the pregnancy would either deliver or kill her. The waiting, the tension, the fear. January brought bitter cold. Snow fell in heavy blankets covering Billings in white. Dan worked longer hours trying to save every dollar he could. Medical expenses were mounting, room and board, Dr. Brennan's fees, the cost of preparing for childbirth. Eliza had become a regular presence. She visited Maggie daily now, teaching her breathing techniques and pain management. The two women had formed an odd friendship, Eliza with her haunted past and Maggie with her uncertain future. One afternoon, Dan came back to find them deep in conversation. He paused outside the door, listening. I lost my baby, Eliza was saying. Stillborn after 20 hours of labor. The doctor said it was my fault. Said I'd done something wrong during the pregnancy. Did you believe them? Maggie asked. For a while. Then I started studying midwifery. Started learning how childbirth actually works. Realized it wasn't my fault. Just bad luck. Wrong position. Umbilical cord around the neck. Nothing I could have prevented. Does that help? Knowing it wasn't your fault? Sometimes. Other times I still feel guilty. Like I should have known. Should have done something. Maggie was quiet for a moment. I'm going to die, aren't I? Eliza didn't offer false comfort. Probably. The numbers suggest it. But I've seen women survive worse odds. Bodies are stubborn sometimes. They do impossible things. Like conceive when 4 doctors say you can't. Exactly like that. Your body has already done one impossible thing. Maybe it has another one left in it. Dan pushed the door open. Both women looked up. Sorry, he said. Didn't mean to interrupt. You weren't, Eliza said, standing. I was just leaving. Same time tomorrow, Maggie. Same time. After Eliza left, Dan sat on the edge of the bed. How are you feeling? Like I'm being slowly crushed from the inside. The baby's running out of room. Everything hurts all the time now. Brennan said that's normal. Brennan says a lot of things. Doesn't make them easier to live with. Dan took her hand. We're going to get through this. You keep saying that. Like if you say it enough times it'll become true. What else can I say? Nothing. There's nothing left to say. We just have to wait and see what happens. February arrived. Maggie was 8 months along now. Huge, uncomfortable, unable to move without pain. The baby pressed on her lungs, making it hard to breathe, pressed on her bladder, making sleep impossible. Her body was a battlefield, and the baby was winning. Dr. Brennan moved her to a room adjacent to his office. Close monitoring now. Every day mattered. Every change in condition needed to be tracked. Ruth came to visit bringing food and clean linens and practical support. She sat with Maggie while Dan worked, offering the kind of companionship that didn't require words. One evening, Ruth found Dan behind the boarding house drinking from a bottle he'd bought with wages he should have saved. "That won't help her," Ruth said. "I know. Then why are you doing it?" "Because I can't stand watching her suffer, can't stand knowing I caused it, can't stand waiting for her to die." Ruth sat down beside him, took the bottle, drank, handed it back. "When I lost my daughter, I wanted to die too. Thought about it every day for a year. Drowning myself in the river, hanging, pills, 100 ways to end it. What stopped you?" "My other children. They'd already lost a sister. Couldn't let them lose a mother too." She looked at him. "Maggie's going to need you. Whether she survives or not, she's going to need you to be there. Not drunk, not guilty, just there. I don't know if I can do that." "Then figure it out, because right now, you're all she has." Mid-February brought a scare. Maggie woke in the middle of the night, blood on the sheets. Not much, but any blood at this stage was cause for concern. Dr. Brennan examined her immediately. Dan paced in the hallway, listening to Maggie's stifled cries of pain as Brennan probed and assessed. Finally, the doctor emerged. "It's not labor, placental irritation. The baby's pressing on blood vessels. It'll keep happening until delivery." "Is she in danger?" "She's been in danger since the moment she conceived. This just makes it more immediate. Can you do anything?" "Watch her closely. Move her here permanently so I can respond quickly if real labor starts. And pray we get lucky." Maggie was moved that night. A small room in Dr. Brennan's house right next to his medical office. Dan stayed with her, sleeping on the floor, refusing to leave despite her insistence that he should rest properly. "I'm not leaving you," he said, "even if I order you to, especially then." She almost smiled. "You're a stubborn man, Daniel Whitmore. I learned from a stubborn woman." Late February. Dr. Brennan received a telegram. He showed it to them during the evening examination. From Dr. Helena Cross in Chicago, he said, "She's one of 3 female surgeons in America. I wrote to her about your case." "What did she say?" Maggie asked. Brennan read from the telegram. "Patient size may be advantage. Strong abdominal muscles can provide natural pressure during pushing. Recommend forceps delivery. Prepare for significant hemorrhage. Success depends on speed and skill. Good luck." "That's not exactly encouraging," Dan observed. "It's realistic," Brennan said. "Dr. Cross has seen cases like this. The fact that she thinks it's possible at all is more encouraging than you might think." "What are forceps?" Maggie asked. "Metal instruments, shaped like large spoons. I insert them and use them to guide the baby's head through the birth canal. It's painful and dangerous, but sometimes it's the only option. And the hemorrhage she mentioned, most women bleed during delivery. But with your anatomy, the trauma of forcing the baby through will likely cause significant tearing. That leads to hemorrhage. If I can't stop the bleeding quickly, you'll die within minutes." Maggie nodded slowly. "So it all comes down to speed. How fast you can get the baby out and how fast you can stop the bleeding." "That's right." She looked at Dan. "Are you ready for that? Am I ready to watch you bleed to death on a table?" "No. But I'll be there anyway because that's what you need." The first week of March was tense. Maggie was 37 weeks now. The baby could come any time. Every twinge, every pain, every irregularity sent them into high alert. Dr. Brennan prepared his instruments. Sterilizing, testing, laying out everything he'd need. Forceps, sutures, cloth for packing, ergot tincture to slow bleeding. The tools of frontier medicine arrayed like weapons for war. Eliza helped with preparations. She and Brennan worked together despite their philosophical differences. Science and intuition, modern medicine and old wisdom. Both would be needed. Dan helped where he could, boiling water, tearing cloth into strips, learning how to apply pressure to stop bleeding. Brennan taught him everything matter-of-fact and methodical. "If she hemorrhages, you'll need to help," the doctor said. "Eliza and I will be working on Maggie. You'll need to manage the baby. Can you do that?" "I'll do whatever you need." Good. Because hesitation will kill them both. On March 10th, Maggie woke at dawn to wetness between her legs. Not blood, clear fluid. Her water had broken. She didn't panic. Just called out Daniel. "It's time." Dan was up instantly. "Brennan. Get Brennan." The doctor appeared within seconds, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. He examined Maggie quickly. "You're in early labor. Contractions will start soon. Once they do, we're committed. No turning back." "I understand," Maggie said. "Dan, go get Eliza and Ruth. We'll need all hands." Dan ran. Found Eliza at the boarding house, Ruth in the kitchen. Both women came immediately bringing supplies and grim determination. By the time they returned, Maggie's contractions had started. Not strong yet. Just the beginning. The early stages of what would be a long battle. Dr. Brennan had transformed the room into something resembling an operating theater. Clean sheets, instruments laid out, hot water boiling, everything ready for what was coming. Maggie sat up in bed, breathing through the contractions. Her face was pale but composed. She'd been preparing for this moment for months. Now it was here. "How long?" she asked Brennan. "First babies average 12 to 18 hours of labor. Could be longer with your anatomy." 18 hours, she repeated. "I can't do this for 18 hours. "Yes, you can," Dan said, taking her hand. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." She looked at him. Her eyes were clear despite the fear in them. "Don't let me die, Daniel. Please don't let me die." "I won't. I swear to God I won't." The contraction passed. Maggie breathed out slowly. Eliza was there with a cool cloth wiping her face. "That's good," Eliza said. "You're doing exactly what you need to do. Just breathe through them. Don't fight. How do you not fight something that feels like being torn in half? You learn. Trust me, you learn." The contractions came faster as morning turned to afternoon. Every 5 minutes. Then every 3. The pain escalating with each wave. Maggie walked between contractions, trying to use gravity to help the baby descend, but her pelvis was fighting the process, resisting, making everything harder than it should be. By evening, she was exhausted. 6 hours of labor and only 3 centimeters dilated. Progress was too slow. The baby was too large. Everything Brennan had warned about was coming true. Dan stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand during contractions, walking with her between them, offering water she couldn't drink and food she couldn't eat, just being present because that was all he could do. Around midnight, Maggie vomited, a sign she was entering transition according to Eliza. The hardest phase, the part where women lost hope. "I can't," Maggie gasped. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," Dan said. "No." She looked at him with wild eyes. "You don't understand. This is your fault. You did this to me." The words cut deep because they were true, but Dan didn't flinch. "You're right. This is my fault, and I'm sorry, but the only way out is through." Maggie screamed as another contraction hit, this one worse than all the others. Dr. Brennan checked her dilation. 8 centimeters. Almost there. "The baby's heart rate is dropping," he said quietly to Eliza. "We're running out of time." "How much time?" "Minutes. Maybe an hour. We need to get her to 10 centimeters and start pushing, or we're going to lose them both." The next hour was hell. Maggie barely conscious between contractions, screaming during them, her body working overtime trying to force the baby through an opening too small. Nature and anatomy locked in fatal combat. Finally, Brennan checked again. 10 centimeters. It's time to push. Maggie looked at him through exhausted eyes. "I can't. You have to. The baby needs to come out now." Dan moved to her side, took her face in his hands, made her look at him. "Maggie, look at me. You crossed an ocean alone. You survived being told you were broken. You've made it this far. 1 more hour. That's all. Just 1 more hour." She was crying now. 1 more hour. 1 more hour. Then we're done. Maggie took a shuddering breath, gathered herself. 1 more hour. The next contraction hit like a cavalry charge. Maggie bore down face-red veins standing out on her neck like rope. Dan held her hand, counted to 10. She collapsed back, gasping. "Good," Dr. Brennan said from between her legs. "But the baby's head is stuck on the pelvic bone. We need forceps." Dan felt his blood run cold. "Will that hurt her?" "It will hurt her worse than anything she's felt yet. But it's that, or she pushes for 5 more hours and dies of exhaustion. Or the baby dies first. Your choice." "It's not my choice," Dan said. "It's hers. Maggie's choice, then." Brennan looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need permission to use forceps. It will be excruciating, but without them, neither of you will survive." Maggie's eyes were glassy with pain and exhaustion. "Do it." Eliza moved to prepare the instruments while Ruth positioned herself to help hold Maggie steady. Dan stayed at her head, gripping her hands. "Don't push on the next contraction," Brennan instructed. "Let me insert the forceps first." The metal instruments looked medieval. 2 curved pieces of steel that would clamp around the baby's head and allow Brennan to pull. Dan had seen similar tools used on calves during difficult births. The comparison made him sick. Another contraction came. Maggie tensed to push, but held back, shaking with the effort of restraint. Brennan inserted the first blade of the forceps. Maggie's scream was inhuman, raw, the sound of agony beyond words. "I'm sorry," Brennan said, working quickly. "I'm so sorry." "Almost there." The second blade went in. Maggie was sobbing now beyond screaming, just broken sounds of pain that tore at Dan's heart. "On the next contraction, push hard, and I'll guide the head," Brennan said. "Ready." The contraction built. Maggie pushed. Brennan pulled with the forceps. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The baby was wedged tight, trapped between metal and bone. Then something gave way with an audible crack. Maggie's pelvis had fractured. Her scream could have woken the dead. It went on, echoing through the house and out into the Billings night. People on the street stopped and stared at Brennan's house, wondering what horror was happening inside. "Stop!" Dan shouted. "You're killing her!" Ruth grabbed him, held him back with surprising strength. "Let him work. I've got it," Brennan said, voice tight with concentration. "The head is through. Maggie, one more push, just one more." Maggie's eyes rolled back. She was going somewhere beyond pain, beyond consciousness, her body taking over where her mind couldn't follow. "Push!" She bore down one final time. A guttural sound emerged from her throat. Primal, the sound of a body destroying itself to create life. The baby slipped out in a rush of blood and fluid. A girl, tiny and red and screaming with healthy lungs. "It's a girl," Brennan said, holding the infant up. 8 pounds 4 ounces. Perfect. Maggie's head fell back against the pillow. "Is she?" "She's perfect," Dan said, crying. "You did it. She's perfect." Eliza moved quickly to clean the baby, wrapping her in a blanket Ruth provided. The infant's cries filled the room, loud and insistent, the sound of life demanding attention. But Dr. Brennan's face had changed. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're hemorrhaging. I need to stop the bleeding." Dan looked down. Blood was pooling under Maggie. Too much blood. It soaked through the sheets, dripped onto the floor. The metallic smell filled the room. "Eliza, apply pressure to the abdomen," Brennan ordered. "Ruth, I need the ergot. Now." Eliza pressed down on Maggie's belly, trying to expel the placenta and contract the uterus. Maggie didn't even react. She was too far gone, staring at the ceiling with unfocused eyes. "Maggie," Dan said, gripping her face. "Stay with me. You hear me? Stay with me." Her eyes found his. Tried to focus. "I'm so tired, Daniel. I know. But you have to stay awake. You have to fight." Ruth appeared with a small bottle. Brennan poured the dark liquid into Maggie's mouth, massaging her throat to make her swallow. Ergot, a medicine made from fungus that could contract the uterus and slow bleeding. If it worked. If it didn't, Maggie would bleed to death in minutes. "I'm losing her pulse," Eliza said, fingers on Maggie's wrist. "It's thready." "Come on," Brennan muttered, packing cloth into the wound, trying to create pressure. "Come on, damn it!" Dan held Maggie's hand. It was cold. Too cold. Her face was white as snow. Her lips were turning blue. "Don't leave me," he whispered. "Please." Maggie, don't leave me." The room fell silent, except for the baby's cries and the frantic rustle of Brennan working. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The longest minute of Dan's life. Then Maggie took a shuddering breath. "Pulse is stabilizing," Eliza said. "It's weak, but it's there." Brennan sat back, hands covered in blood. "The bleeding is slowing. The ergot's working." Dan pressed his forehead against Maggie's hand. "Thank God. Thank God." "She's not out of danger yet," Brennan warned. "The next 24 hours are critical. If infection sets in or the bleeding starts again, we could still lose her. But she's alive. For now." Maggie's eyes fluttered closed, unconscious but breathing, her body shutting down to focus on survival, on healing the catastrophic damage of the birth. The baby had quieted, nestled in Ruth's arms. She was beautiful despite being covered in the remnants of her violent entry into the world. Dark hair, strong lungs, her father's nose, and her mother's determined chin. "You want to hold her?" Ruth asked Dan. He looked at the tiny creature, his daughter, the child who'd nearly killed her mother, the child Maggie had risked everything to bring into the world. "I don't know how." Ruth showed him. "Support the head. Keep her close to your body, like this." The weight of her was nothing. 7 or 8 pounds of new life, warm and alive and completely dependent. Dan stared down at her, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the fear and the love that came crashing over him. "She's looking for Maggie," Ruth said gently, "looking for her mother. Will Maggie be able to feed her if she survives the night? If not, we'll need a wet nurse." The baby made small sounds, searching. Dan felt helpless holding her, this tiny person he'd helped create who'd nearly cost Maggie everything. Dr. Brennan was cleaning his instruments, washing the blood from his hands. "That was the worst delivery I've performed in 30 years, he said. "But she made it. Against all odds, she made it." "How bad was it?" Dan asked. "The fracture to her pelvis will heal, but she'll have chronic pain. Probably walk with a limp for the rest of her life. The internal tearing was severe. It's possible she'll have complications later. Incontinence. Continued pain. And she can never under any circumstances get pregnant again. Another pregnancy would kill her without question." Dan nodded. "Understood. I'm serious, Whitmore. One more pregnancy means certain death. You need to keep that in mind." "I will." Brennan looked at him hard. "Make sure you do." The hours passed slowly. Maggie remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Dan held the baby, who'd finally fallen asleep after Ruth managed to get a little goat's milk into her. Around dawn, Maggie's eyes opened, confused at first, then focusing. She looked around the room until she found Dan holding the baby. "Is she?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "She's perfect, healthy, beautiful, just like you said she'd be. Can I?" Dan brought the baby to her. Maggie didn't have the strength to hold her alone, so Dan supported both of them, creating a careful arrangement of mother and child. Maggie looked down at the tiny face. Tears ran down her cheeks. "Hello, little one. I'm your mother. I almost died bringing you here." The baby stirred, making small sounds. "She's hungry," Dan said. "Help me," Maggie whispered. Between Dan and Ruth, they managed to position the baby to nurse. It took several tries, but eventually she latched on, drawing milk with surprising strength. "That's good," Ruth said. "Very good. Means she's healthy." Maggie looked up at Dan. "I'm alive." "Yes. I didn't think I would be. Neither did I. What happens now?" "Now you rest, heal, get strong again. That's all you need to worry about. And the baby? We'll take care of her until you can. Ruth's already found a wet nurse for the next few days. After that, you should be strong enough to feed her yourself." Maggie's eyes were already closing. "So tired," she murmured. "So very tired." "Sleep," Dan said. "I'll watch her." Maggie drifted off with the baby still at her breast. Dan carefully removed the infant once she'd fallen asleep, handed her to Ruth. "I'll take her to the wet nurse," Ruth said. "You should rest too. I'm not leaving Maggie." "Stubborn man. I learned from a stubborn woman." Ruth almost smiled. "That you did." The days that followed were a blur. Maggie remained bedridden, too weak to do more than nurse the baby when Ruth brought her. Dr. Brennan checked on her twice daily, monitoring for signs of infection or renewed bleeding. Dan stayed by her side, leaving only to work enough hours to pay their mounting bills. Samuel Chen was understanding, letting him work irregular hours. Ruth extended credit on the room and board. The community of Billings, small as it was, rallied around them. On the third day, Maggie was strong enough to sit up. On the fifth day, she could stand with assistance. On the seventh day, she took her first steps. The limp was pronounced. Every movement caused visible pain, but she was mobile. The baby thrived. She ate well, slept well, cried with impressive volume when she wanted attention. A healthy, normal infant who had no idea how close she'd come to never existing at all. 2 weeks after the birth, Dan found Maggie standing at the window looking out at Billings. The baby was asleep in a cradle Dr. Brennan had brought. Maggie was leaning heavily on a cane Ruth had found for her. "You should be resting," Dan said. "I've done nothing but rest for 2 weeks. I needed to stand, to see the world. How's the pain constant? Manageable. A reminder that I survived." She turned to look at him. "We need to talk about what happens next." "All right. I've been thinking. About us. About what you did. About whether I can live with it." Dan felt his stomach drop. "And I can't forgive you. I want to be clear about that. What you did was unforgivable. You manipulated me, gambled with my life, put me through hell because you couldn't stand being alone for one night. I know." But she continued, "You've spent the last 6 months proving you can be better than your worst moment. You stayed. You worked. You were there when I needed you. That has to count for something. What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm willing to try. Not because I forgive you. Because I believe people can change if they choose to. And you're choosing." Dan felt something break open in his chest. "I don't deserve this." "No." Maggie agreed. "You don't. But she does." She gestured to the sleeping baby. "She deserves a father who's present, who tries, who understands what he did wrong and works every day to be better. Can you be that?" "Yes, I swear I can." "Then that's what we'll do. We'll try. One day at a time. No promises except that we'll keep trying." Dan wanted to hold her, to pull her close and never let go, but he held back. Let her set the pace. Let her decide what she could handle. "Thank you," he said instead. "Don't thank me. Just prove I'm making the right choice." The baby stirred in her sleep, making small sounds. Both of them turned to look at her. "We need to name her," Maggie said. "What were you thinking, Grace?" "Undeserved gift." Dan felt tears prick his eyes. "Grace Whitmore. Grace Lundstrom Whitmore. She carries both of us. Your name and my strength." He nodded, unable to speak. "Come here," Maggie said. He approached carefully. She took his hand, placed it on the baby's chest, felt the tiny heartbeat under his palm. "This is Grace," Maggie said. "Your daughter. My daughter. The impossible child who nearly killed me and taught us both what we're capable of. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right," Dan said. "I know. That's why I'm giving you the chance." They stood together watching Grace sleep, a family forged in pain and mistake, and the desperate hope that tomorrow could be better than today. A month after the birth, they made a short trip back to the ranch. Just to check on things secure, the property, decide what came next. Dan had hired a neighbor boy to watch the place while they were gone, but it needed more attention than a boy could give. The ranch looked smaller than Dan remembered, or maybe he'd just changed, seen things that put 150 acres into perspective. Maggie walked the property slowly, leaning on her cane. Grace was strapped to her chest in a carrier Ruth had helped her make. The baby was alert now, looking around with curious eyes. "It needs work," Maggie observed. "Fences are down, the barn needs repairs, the house needs cleaning. We can hire help. I know a young man in town, Thomas Carter. Orphan, good worker. He could stay here, manage things. And us. We stay in Billings another 2 months, until you're fully healed and Brennan clears you for regular activity. Then we come back." Maggie nodded, looked up at the hill where Sarah was buried. "Can we go there? Are you sure I need to?" They climbed the hill slowly. Maggie's limp made it difficult, and Dan had to help her over the rough ground. But she was determined. Sarah's grave was weathered but intact. The wooden cross was fading, the name carved into it barely visible. Dan had never replaced it with stone like he'd planned, just another thing he'd meant to do and never finished. Maggie stood looking at the grave for a long moment. Then she spoke not to Dan, but to the woman buried there. "Hello, Sarah. I'm Margaret. I married your husband. He let me think you died because childbirth was inherently dangerous, that your death was inevitable. But it wasn't. Was it? You had bad luck. I had a bad husband. Different stories, same ending almost." Maggie shifted Grace in the carrier. "I survived. Barely. My body's broken in ways that won't heal. I walk with a cane now. Might always walk with a cane. The price of proving Swedish doctors wrong. The price of Daniel's selfishness. Take your pick of reasons." She paused. Grace made a small sound, and Maggie automatically rocked her. "I don't know if you can hear this. Don't know if there's anything after. But if there is, I want you to know I'm not trying to replace you. Can't replace you. I'm just trying to survive being married to a man who makes terrible choices and then has to live with them." Dan stood a few feet back, giving her space, listening to her talk to his first wife's ghost. "He's trying, though," Maggie continued. "That's something. He stayed with me through the whole thing, worked himself half to death to pay the medical bills, held my hand while I screamed and bled and almost died, so he's not entirely worthless." She smiled slightly. "Grace is beautiful." 8 pounds of stubborn Swedish determination wrapped in angry American cries. She looks like him mostly, but she's got my size, going to be tall, strong, the kind of woman who terrifies small men and attracts complicated ones, just like her mother. Maggie turned to look at Dan then. "I'm not asking for your blessing, don't need your permission, but I wanted you to know I'm here, that I survived what you didn't, that I'm trying to make something good out of Daniel's mistakes." She reached down, touched the weathered cross. "Rest easy, Sarah. Your husband is my problem now." They walked back down the hill in silence. At the house, Maggie sat on the porch while Dan packed a few things they'd need back in Billings. Grace had fallen asleep, lulled by the walk and the Montana wind. "That was kind," Dan said, sitting beside her. "What you said to Sarah, it wasn't kind, it was honest. There's a difference. Still, you didn't have to acknowledge her. She was your wife. She mattered to you. Pretending she didn't exist won't make anything better." Dan looked out at his land, the ranch he'd built, the life he'd tried to create. It all seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to what Maggie had endured. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I keep saying it, but I am." "I know." Maggie adjusted Grace in the carrier. "Sorry doesn't change anything, but it's something, and right now, something is enough." They returned to Billings the next day. Life resumed its careful rhythm. Maggie healing Grace, growing Dan working. The slow rebuilding of a life that had nearly ended before it began. Dr. Brennan continued his examinations, documenting everything. The fracture was healing well. The internal injuries were scarring over. Maggie would survive with chronic pain and limited mobility, but she would survive. In late April, a letter arrived from Sweden. Dr. Eric Lindstrom, one of the physicians who'd examined Maggie years ago. She opened it with shaking hands. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well." She read it aloud to Dan, her voice catching on certain phrases. "Miss Hayes's medical paper documenting your case was published in the Stockholm Journal of Medicine last month. The details of your pregnancy, delivery, and survival have caused significant discussion in our medical community. Your case proves that our diagnosis of sterility was incorrect. We conflated highly unlikely with impossible. This was a failure of medical precision that caused you unnecessary suffering. I have reviewed our examinations from 1879 through 1882. We focused on your pelvic measurements and hormonal irregularities. We did not consider that unlikely still means possible, nor that a woman of your constitution might survive what would kill others. Your strength, both physical and mental, was the determining factor in your survival. Not luck, not miracle. Strength. I am updating our clinic's protocols. Future patients with similar anatomy will be told the truth. Conception is unlikely. Pregnancy will be high risk. But neither is impossible. I apologize for telling you that you were not meant to be a mother. You have proven us wrong in the most definitive way possible. Respectfully, Dr. Eric Lindstrom. Maggie set the letter down. Her hands were trembling. How do you feel? Dan asked. Vindicated. And furious. Why furious? Because all those years I believed I was broken, that I was a mistake of nature. They took that from me with their certainty, made me feel defective when I was just unlikely. But you proved them wrong. I shouldn't have had to almost die to prove it. She stood, walked to the window. Grace was with Ruth downstairs giving Maggie a few hours of rest. The room was quiet, except for the distant sounds of Billings going about its business. I want to frame this, Maggie said, holding up the letter. Put it on the wall. So Grace knows her mother was never broken, just born into a world with limited imagination. Dan joined her at the window. She can have my copy too, the medical paper Eliza published. Both documents, proof that unlikely isn't impossible. Maggie looked at him. You're trying very hard. I know. Is it working? Honestly, I don't know yet. Ask me in a year. Fair enough. They stood together, not touching, but close. Outside, spring was transforming Montana. The brown grass turning green, flowers blooming. The world renewing itself the way it did every year. Life insisting on itself despite winter's attempts to end it. In June, they returned to the ranch permanently. Maggie was strong enough now for the journey. Grace was 3 months old, healthy and growing. Thomas Carter had kept the place running, and they hired him on permanently to help with the heavy work Maggie couldn't do anymore. The first night back, Dan stood on the porch watching the sun set over his land. The sky was painted in reds and golds, the last light of day turning everything beautiful. Maggie joined him, Grace asleep in her arms. She moved slowly, the cane in her free hand, but she moved. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I'm the luckiest man alive, and the most undeserving. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. No, they're not." Grace stirred, made a small sound. Maggie rocked her automatically, a gesture that had become second nature. "I've been thinking," Maggie said, "about the future. And we should adopt. There are children who need homes, orphans from the reservations, children from families that can't feed them. We have space, resources. We could help." Dan looked at her. "You want more children? I want Grace to have siblings. Want to fill this ranch with life instead of ghosts. Want to prove that good things can come from terrible choices if we work hard enough. Another baby then. One we don't have to risk your life for. Several babies. As many as we can manage. This place is too quiet with just the 3 of us." Dan felt something settle in his chest. Something like peace, like redemption earned through years of daily effort. "All right," he said. "We'll adopt." "Good." Maggie smiled. "Now help me inside. My leg is killing me." He offered his arm. She took it, leaning on him as they walked into the house. Grace between them, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the conversation that would shape her future. Inside, Dan lit lamps while Maggie settled into a chair with Grace. The house was simple but comfortable, nothing fancy, but it was theirs, built from mistakes and survival and the determination to be better tomorrow than they were today. "Tell me something true," Maggie said. Dan looked at her. The woman who'd survived the impossible, who'd proven doctors wrong, who'd forgiven him enough to keep trying. "I love you," he said. "I know I don't have the right to say it. No, I haven't earned it. But it's true." Maggie was quiet for a long moment. "Then I know. Is that all you're going to say?" "For now. Love is earned, Daniel. You're working on it. Check back in a year." "Fair enough." Grace woke crying. Maggie began nursing her while Dan prepared their evening meal, the simple domestic routine of a family. Nothing remarkable, nothing special, just 3 people trying to build a life from the wreckage of bad choices and unlikely survival. That night, Dan lay in bed listening to Maggie's breathing in the darkness. They still slept in separate rooms, her choice. But sometimes, like tonight, she'd ask him to stay until she fell asleep. "Are you awake?" she whispered. "Yes." "Do you think about that night? The night that started all this every day. Do you regret it?" "Yes." "And no." She turned to look at him in the darkness. "Explain. I regret what I did to you. The manipulation, the risk, the pain. But I can't regret Grace. Can't regret that you survived. Can't regret that we're here now trying to build something good, even if I never love you back. Even then." Maggie was quiet. Then, "You're a complicated man, Daniel Whitmore. I'm a man who made terrible choices and is spending his life making better ones. Is that enough? Some days. Other days I don't know." She reached out in the darkness, found his hand, held it. "Some days is enough," she said. "We'll figure out the other days as they come." Dan held her hand until her breathing evened out and she fell asleep. Then he quietly left, returning to his own room, giving her the space she needed, respecting the boundaries she'd set. In the morning he'd wake early, work the ranch, care for Grace when Maggie needed rest. Keep proving he could be better than his worst moment, because that's what redemption was. Not a single grand gesture, not an apology accepted and sins forgiven, just the daily choice to be present, to try, to keep going even when you didn't deserve to. Years passed. Grace grew into a bright, strong child. They adopted 2 more children, a Shoshone girl named Sarah after Dan's first wife, and a boy named Eric after the Swedish doctor who'd apologized. The ranch prospered. Thomas became like family, staying on as foreman. Ruth visited often, a grandmother in all but name. Dr. Brennan retired but stayed in Billings watching his most remarkable case thrive against all odds. Maggie never stopped walking with a cane, never stopped having pain. But she adapted, found ways to work around her limitations, became a fierce advocate for other women facing difficult pregnancies, writing letters to medical journals and hosting discussions in Billings about maternal health. Her story spread. The impossible pregnancy, the woman who survived what should have killed her. Other women found hope in her survival, found courage in her stubborn refusal to die when everyone said she would. Dan worked the ranch and raised the children and tried every day to be the husband Maggie deserved. Some days he succeeded. Some days he failed. But he never stopped trying. And Maggie. She lived, not happily ever after because life wasn't a fairy tale, but she lived fully, honestly, with scars that reminded her of her strength and a limp that proved she'd survived the unsurvivable. In 1888, 5 years after Grace's birth, Dan found Maggie on the porch one evening. She was watching the children play in the yard. Grace at 8 years old, already tall as Dan. Sarah at 4, quick and clever. Eric at 2, all smiles and energy. "What are you thinking?" Dan asked, sitting beside her. "That we did it. Against all odds, we actually did it. Did what made something good out of something terrible. Built a family from mistakes and survival and sheer stubborn determination not to let the bad things win." Dan looked at the children. His impossible family. The life he didn't deserve but was grateful for anyway. "You did that," he said. "I just helped." Maggie smiled. "Still lying to yourself, I see. Still telling the truth." She reached for his hand. He took it, marveling as always that she let him touch her, that she'd forgiven him enough for this small intimacy. "Do you love me yet?" he asked. It had become a ritual question, asked once a year, always answered honestly. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, finally. Surprisingly, against my better judgment. But yes. Dan felt his throat tighten. "Since when?" "Since I realized that redemption isn't about erasing what you did. It's about who you became after. And you became someone worth loving." "I don't deserve it." "No," she agreed. "But you earned it anyway. Those aren't the same thing, but they're both true." Grace ran up to the porch, breathless and laughing. "Mama, Papa, come see what Sarah and Eric built." They stood following their daughter to where the younger children had constructed an elaborate fort from fallen branches and blankets. The structure was precarious, but impressive. a monument to childhood creativity and sibling cooperation. "This is amazing," Maggie said, crouching down to admire it despite the pain in her leg. "We made it together," Sarah announced proudly. Grace helped too. "Teamwork," Dan observed. "That's good. Like family." Eric added his vocabulary, still simple, but his meaning clear. "Like family," Maggie repeated, looking at Dan over the children's heads. He held her gaze. In it, he saw everything they'd been through: the pain, the mistakes, the near death and hard survival, the daily choice to keep trying even when it would have been easier to give up. But he also saw tomorrow, and the day after that, a future they'd fought for and earned through sheer stubborn refusal to let the past define them completely. The Montana wind blew across the ranch, carrying the smell of grass and sky and possibility. The children played in their fort while the adults watched, grateful and scarred and alive. Not perfect, never perfect, but real, honest, built from truth and consequence and the understanding that sometimes the best you can do is simply survive and then figure out how to live with what surviving cost. The sun began to set, painting the sky in those familiar reds and golds. On the hill, Sarah's grave stood witness to all they'd become, a reminder of loss, but also of the second chances that come from facing what you've done and choosing to be better. Grace ran to Maggie, wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. "I love you, Mama." Maggie hugged her back, this impossible child who'd nearly killed her, this gift undeserved but treasured beyond measure. "I love you too, little one, more than you'll ever know." The family stood together as darkness fell. Not perfect, never perfect, but together, trying, building a life from the pieces of what had almost been the end. And sometimes in the vast Montana territory, where the land was hard and the winters were brutal and survival itself was a daily miracle, sometimes that was enough. 2 years after that evening, I rode out to the Whitmore Ranch again. Montana Cattlemen's Association business. Needed Dan's signature on water rights paperwork. Found him in the yard teaching a little blonde girl how to rope. She was 4 years old now, too young for roping really. But Grace laughed every time the loop fell short, and Dan laughed with her. Maggie came out of the house walking with that pronounced limp she'd carry forever, but she was smiling. Carried a dark-haired infant on her hip. Sarah, they'd named her. Adopted Shoshone girl whose mother died in childbirth. "Another impossible case?" Maggie said when she saw my expression. "Seems I collect them." Inside there was a third child, a boy of about 6 months, Eric, after the Swedish doctor who'd apologized. The house was full of noise and life and the kind of chaos that comes from children who know they're wanted. Dan signed the papers. Maggie offered coffee. I stayed for an hour listening to them talk about the future, about expanding the ranch, about the children's education, about ordinary things that people who'd survived the extraordinary got to worry about. Riding away, I thought about the stories we tell, about the woman who crossed an ocean, about the man who made a terrible choice, about the child born from impossibility, about how sometimes redemption isn't a moment, it's a lifetime of small choices, of showing up, of trying. Dan Whitmore had gambled with a woman's life, had nearly destroyed her in his weakness. But he'd spent every day since proving he understood the weight of that. That didn't make it right, but it made it human. And out here on the Montana frontier, human was sometimes the best we could hope for. The wind blew cold that autumn day, but inside the Whitmore ranch house the fire was warm. 3 children laughed. A woman with a limp taught them Swedish words, and a man who'd once been a coward held them all together. Not perfect, but alive, and trying, in this hard land that was miracle enough.